Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first of two panels that the Charles Olson Society will be hosting in a virtual format this year. Our panel title, Outside of the Western Box, derives from Charles Olson's important text, The Mayan Letters. There, writing to Creeley on July 1st of 1951, he outlines one of his characteristic bibliographies meant for studying, quote, the last remnant of the older life, the life which had been man's way all that time until our generation, end quote. A way of life that gives the Yucatan such resonance. Like many of Olson's makeshift bibliographies, the list of books is scattered, idiosyncratic, and crosses many different disciplines, including Mayanists like J. Eric S. Thompson and A.V. Kidder, writers like Melville and Lawrence, and historians like Brooks Adams, as well as Frobenius, Jane Harrison, and Pausanias. He does include Ezra Pound, but reluctantly so. Quote, Ezra Pound, he states, guide to culture just because it razzle-dazzles history and any learning, but its loss is exactly that, plus the poet's admitted insistence that he will stay inside the Western box. Gemisto, 1429 AD, up, end quote. Our purpose in these panels is to explore what this phrase means and has meant for the poetics of projective verse, for American poetry in general, and for ongoing theoretical debates about poetics today. Our first presenter will be Joe Safdie, whose new book of poems from Sput and Duyvil is called The Oregon Trail. His own trail to Oregon included pit stops in California, San Diego, Bolinas, San Francisco, Venice Beach, Colorado, Boulder, Washington, Seattle, and the Czech Republic, Olomouc, and Prague. Now in Portland and retired from college teaching, he's studying the language of trees. Previous books and their publishers include Mary Shelley's Surfboard, Kevin Upstettel, Blue Press, 2008, Scholarship, Jeffrey Gatza, Blaise Vox, 2014, and Coastal Zone, Todd Thielman, Sput and Duyvil, 2016. A few of his essays on Charles Olson and Ed Dorn can be found on Dispatches from the Poetry Wars, which is edited by Michael Bone and Kent Johnson. Second will be J. Peter Moore, who teaches and writes on US literature and culture, particularly modern and contemporary poetry and poetics, aesthetic theory, and African-American literature. His book project, Vernacular Poetics in an Era of Vernacular Studies, examines the emergence of the term vernacular as an analytical category in the years following the Second World War across a number of social, scientific, academic disciplines, reading this trend in relation to concurrent poetic theories of the vernacular in an effort to explore competing ideas about the nature of informal knowledge production. He's the author of two poetry collections, Southern Color Type from 3 Count Pour, 2013, and Zippers and Jeans, Selva Obscura, 2017, and is the co-founder of Lute and Drum, an online arts journal. He is clinical assistant professor and director of creative projects at Purdue University Honors College. Our panel will end today with Jeff Davis, whose poems have appeared in Asheville Poetry Review, the Nantahala Review, Kakalak, Iodine, the anthologies In the Belly of the Beast, and Far from the Centers of Ambition, and other print and online journals. His Natures, Selected Poems, 1972 to 2005, appeared in 2006. He has hosted the weekly radio program Wordplay, which features poets and writers of creative prose since 2005. It's now broadcast via AshevilleFM.org and WSFM 103.3 on the FM radio dial in the Asheville area. The program has featured readings and interviews with Robert Creeley, Robert Bly, Charles Frazier, Charles Bohr, Michael Rummaker, Thomas Rain Crow, Jessica Jacobs, Sebastian Matthews, Leanne Brown, Kathleen Stripling Beyer, Michael Hedich, and many other writers during its 16-year run. He reminded me by email today that also, Nathaniel Mackey and Gary Snyder have in fact been on the program as well. So I will let Joe take it away, and I'm going to mute myself and go ahead, Joe.
Okay. Thanks, Josh, and thanks for organizing all of this. You've been an excellent administrator of the Olson Society. Hello, folks. And whether it's morning or afternoon for you. I am going to show you a few slides. Host disabled participant screen sharing. So Josh, does that mean I can't?
It's on now. It's on now. Take it away.
Okay. Got it. Desktop 1, share. Ah, okay. a very few slides I have for you as I read and talk. Most of you probably know that Brooks Adams was the descendant of two presidents, John Adams and John Quincy Adams, and the younger brother of the more famous Henry Adams. And his distinguished family was always a huge burden for him. Although I'm mostly going to talk about his book, The New Empire, because that was what Olson mentioned most often. Another interesting piece of his is the heritage of Henry Adams. The introduction to a book of Henry's later essays called The Degradation of the Democratic Dogma. In it, it's clear that Brooks identifies with what he calls the failures of his great-grandfather and grandfather, and cheerily predicts with Henry that thought will have reached the end of its possibilities in 1925, followed by chaos, massacres, and the end of the world. So before we talk about his attraction to Olson, it's important to understand one big difference. The Adams brothers always saw entropy on the horizon. They believed in the second law of thermodynamics, while Olson, as I read him, is one of the greatest practitioners of neg-entropy in our literature. Brooks's relationship with his brother was his most important intellectual influence, and they shared many ideas. A change of phase, writes Henry in his late essay, The Rule of Phase as Applied to History, was to be recognized by a change of form, that is, by a change of direction, and was caused by acceleration, an increase of volume or concentration. If we substitute those terms from physics for precious metals and economics, we have a pretty good summary of the new empire. So it's fairly amusing that around the time it was written, Henry had bought a small colored print by the French artist, Jean-Francois Raffaelli, because the two small donkeys are wonderfully like me and my brother Brooks. Brooks looking sideways as though preparing to kick, while I looked straight at you, patient and resigned. Because Brooks Adams was a difficult man. In a long essay on his work and thought in 1948, Daniel Aaron called him unusable. There are still many people in Boston and Cambridge who remember this eccentric and arrogant man, that essay begins, and proceeds to mention his gruff manner and his penchant for saying shocking things at dinner tables. Other troublesome qualities included imperialism, anti-feminism, and anti-Semitism. The latter partly because of his lifelong hostility to the bankers or gold bugs. And when we recall the famous motto of Teddy Roosevelt's presidency, speak softly, but carry a big stick, we might remember that the big stick was Brooks Adams' idea. To his credit, he was aware of how he came across to others. Here's what he wrote about himself in Heritage of Henry Adams. That same summer, I came home and married, explaining to the woman who consented to share my fortunes, which were likely to be none of the most brilliant, that I was eccentric, almost to madness, and that if she married me, she must do so on her own responsibility and at her own risk. She seemed to regard this as a kind of poor joke, but in the end, she found it serious enough. This seems to me like accurate self-analysis. Just how serious his wife took it isn't immediately apparent in this letter she sent from their trip to Venice in 1894. Brooks is reading all sorts of abstruse works in their original. I enjoy the gondola and making no exertion. Brooks enjoys going miles and miles out of town astride a bicycle and also learns to row the gondola rather than sit in it at rest. I don't think I can keep him contented here much longer. And then we shall roam through the Black Forest and learn German. And as I wandered, Adams wrote in Heritage, and looked at the remains of the past and considered the topography of the lands I had visited, ideas came to me as wide as the poles from what I had previously supposed such ideas could be. And here we start to get at one of the reasons he was so attractive to Olson, not so much for his specific ideas, although some of those will surface in surprising ways in the Maximus poems, but because of his method. In 1895, he confessed, quote, "I can't masquerade as a scholar seeking truth at the bottom of a well. I am dealing with all the burning questions of our time." A year later, he describes his earlier book, The Law of Civilization and Decay. "I never read the book through consecutively till I read it in Rome, and then I read it with the utmost astonishment. I had no conception that it would be what it is. In other words, it was automatic and was the work of some second self, a self who must be very active, but who does not come to the surface." That's not projective verse, but it'll do in a pinch. Adams also shared with Olson a penchant for dividing history into broad periods of time, but rather than static categorizations like golden, silver, and bronze, or classic, medieval, and Renaissance, his involved movement, as in this self-blurb from the New Empire. Maps ordinarily represent repose, but I have tried to suggest motion by colored lines drawn from fixed bases to an ever-changing seat of empire. In civilization, nothing is at rest, least of all the circulation, and the arteries through which that circulation flows vary in direction from generation to generation. In his review of the New Empire in 1954, Olson wrote that history before Adams had been repose. And 6 months later, the book showed up in the Bibliography on America for Ed Dorn, where, quoting Whitehead, Olson wrote, "We should start from the notion of actuality as, in its essence, a process." I've always had a special fondness for the bibliography because I studied with Edward, and after I left Boulder, I read almost every book on that list. It's not just a list of books, as Bed Freelander wrote. It's about methodology. The bibliography was delivered to Dorn's window at Black Mountain one night in January 1955. And the New Empire was on the list under millennia, one of the 4 axes, or the double axe he developed to siphon energy and attention away from the local, which he wrote, along with the sentimental, is how humanism comes home to roost in America. Millennia was different than time as history, and seeing the local through its lens can change it into something intensely active and alive rather than a crutch of ambience. As I'll suggest at the end, that's a central concern of the Maximus poems. Right after the chart of the double axe is the important phrase, applying all 4 of these at once, which is what I mean by attention. Attention is a key concept for Olson. I like the way Don Bird, one of our finest readers of Olson, puts it in his Poetics of the Common Knowledge. Quote, "We are now faced with the task of recalling the organism from historical time, where it had been placed in a domain of scaleless abstraction, to somatic time, where it can begin once again to deal responsibly with its environment." The Critical Art Ensemble puts it this way, quote, "First, organic being in the world must be reestablished as the locus of reality, placing the virtual back in its proper place as simulacra," he said on Zoom. Back in 1965, Olson closed the Vinland Map Review with a reminder, the care, anyway, in any of this is to improve or regain an attention, which offhand would seem to be lost, certainly decisively by 1250. Another way to get at this improvement is implied by the title of the presentations today and tomorrow, Outside the Western Box. As Josh told you, it comes from another book recommendation in Olson's Mayan Letters for Pound's Guide to Culture, with the qualification that Pound stays, quote, inside the Western Box, Gemisto 1429 AD and up. In the bibliography, Olson calls this the trap of history as time, or as he writes in the Vinland Map Review, history as usual, Renaissance-y modern-mindedness. Likewise, Brooks Adams didn't much like history as a term for what he was doing. "It sounds like Harvard," he wrote. That's a special view of history. He would also never allow himself to be put inside a box, Western or otherwise, as a few examples of his machete-like prose might testify. The Romans were rigid, and the massacres which attended their readjustments are memorable. The slaughter of the Gracchi, the proscriptions of Marius and Sulla, and the lists of the triumvirs are examples. On the other hand, Caesar miscarried because of too high intelligence. He measured circumstances accurately, and because he did so, he misjudged others. Had he comprehended the stupidity of Brutus, he would have killed him. And about a millennium later, the medieval cleric was a powerful necromancer. Nuns and monks worked day and night to ensure intercession with the supernatural. By 450, the miracle rose in value, and the church grew wealthy enough to begin the monastic movement. This no-nonsense style is one reason he warns in his introduction that ideals will probably suffer. An echo of Olson's preference for Melville's physicality, his ability to go inside a thing and from its motion and his to know not its essence alone. This was mostly the gift of ideality, but its dimension, that part of a thing which ideality tended to diminish. So a focus on millennia brings in more gritty and particular detail, which any reader of Olson will be familiar with, a break against any kind of universalizing tendency. His speculations about different locations, the Yucatan, Tyre, and Cyprus, the Scandinavian countries of the Vinland Map Review, are all related in a general way, quote, so that gesture and action born of the earth may in turn join heaven and hell. One wants phenomenology in place, he writes, in order that event may re-arise. In other words, he wants to get as graphic as the earth is, which Brooks Adams achieved, he wrote, by going below all the laws. He also found similarities between Adams and other historical exemplars like John Smith. Why I sing John Smith, he wrote, is this, that the geographic, the sudden land of the place is in there, not described, not local, not represented. Like all advertisements, all the shit now pours out. The American road, the filthiness of graphic words. Or as Adams had it in the preface of The New Empire, all my observations lead to the conclusion that geographical conditions have exercised a great, possibly a preponderating influence over man's destiny. I'm convinced that neither history nor economics can be intelligently studied without a constant reference to the geographical surroundings which have affected different nations. So, movement and ideals and geography, and just a few more things. In a further note about the advantages of Eric Havelock, Olson concludes, 1, that the gods and heroes of mythology are metaphors, and 2, that both gods and heroes are conspicuous and public. Adams, for his part, calls attention to Jason bringing back the golden fleece from Colchis and Hercules, who sought in the garden of the Hesperides those golden apples, which were to be plucked in Spain. These mythological figures were actually predecessors to the miners whose gold from Potosi propped up the European economy in the early 16th century, and whose gold from Sacramento propped up the American economy in the 20th. Movement in these cases was engineered by trade, especially trade for metals. People needed them to make superior tools, and power and money followed their most efficient extraction. Olson quotes Adams as saying March 1897 was the month where consolidation at Pittsburgh undersold the world in steel, thus beginning the new empire of the United States. Adams lays out the stakes at the end of his preface. Nature has cast the United States into the vortex of the fiercest struggle which the world has ever known. She has become the heart of the economic system of the age, and she must maintain her supremacy by wit and by force, or share the fate of the discarded. What that fate is, the following pages tell. For Adams, this consolidation was inevitable and necessary. How civilizations and empires were formed and maintained with swift, ruthless administration, in the face of which democracy didn't stand a chance. In this, he agreed with his brother Henry. And in letter 15 of the Maximus poems, right after he refers to Pound and Gemisto and 1429, Olson says, quote, the American epos, 1902, or when did Barton, and Barton? 1902 was the publication date of the new empire. By the way, there was a story in the New York Times a few weeks ago that steel is enjoying boom times again, partly because of the Trump tariffs. But the economic competition now, especially with China, is focused on other metals, the kind that have to be mined for green energy, a group of metals known as rare earth elements used in the production of magnets and batteries, which makes them of interest to renewable energy companies and other high-tech concerns. They can be very costly to mine. So the empire moves on, a metal hot from boiling waters. So I want to close with some thoughts about how a millennial focus infuses the Maximus poems. In an untitled essay written March 14th, 1965, Olson wrote, quote, the hero of my poem, Maximus of Gloucester, is in truth Maximus of Tyre. And thus, whether I liked it or not, at a very early point, in fact, in the very first letter addressed to Gloucester, the position offshore of Maximus is indeed an enormous expropriation of the other side of the Atlantic. The other side, all the way back to man's first leaving the massive land continent of Asia for Cyprus, the first island made into a peninsula when Alexander, to reduce her for the first time in history, as late as 333 BC, built the Mole. The Mole is a highway that connected Tyre to the mainland, just as Gloucester is connected to the mainland by Highway 128. So Gloucester isn't Tyre, exactly, and Maximus isn't Maximus of Tyre, exactly. It's not a reference, he says in a note among his papers, October 1969. It's an inner inherence. And Tyre, of course, was the chief city of the Phoenicians, about whom Adams writes, quote, the Phoenicians were the greatest navigators and metallurgists of antiquity. They penetrated every inlet and prospected in every land. And as the sphere of Phoenician enterprise expanded, the lines of communication changed to correspond. In an echo, George Butterick wrote, quote, Olson chose Maximus before he had a fully developed sense of Tyre as being an old world analog for Gloucester, the chief port of the Phoenicians, the same way Gloucester was a center of the American fishing industry, and the last holdout against Alexander the Great's universalism. I have Jeff Davis to thank for that link to Butterick's annotations, but let Olson say it in a tape he made at Goddard College. The only thing in the world that confronted the universalization that Alexander proposed, which I think is the great compliment to the present, was Tyre. It so refused to be knocked down by this Macedonian athlete that it was the sole place in the world which bucked him. And it took Alexander 3 or 4 years to reduce Tyre. And in order to get at her, he built a mole from the mainland. In a note from February 10th, 1960, among his papers, Olson would write, quote, the interest is not in the local at all as such, any local, and the choice of Gloucester is particular. That is, the point of the interest, particularism itself, to reveal it in all possible ways and force against the loss of value of the universal. Tyre as, with Gaza, the only city which resented Alexander's universalization. If you ever read this paper online or in print, feel free to linger on that last line. So one last collage of Olson's unpublished notes, and we're home. January 1960. Quickly, the poem is a man, Maximus, addressing a city, Gloucester, to induce its people, himself among them, to see and take life in and be a scale of which they and their fishing say are better examples than any outside or universal reference. that the relevance lies in what is nearest and most familiar, that the smallest or least can be lived in. And mythologos 2. I regard Gloucester as the final movement of the Earth's people, the great migratory thing. Migration ended in Gloucester. The motion of man upon the earth has a line, an oblique northwest tending line, and Gloucester was the last shore in that sense. The fact that the continent and the series of such developments as have followed have occupied 300 and some odd years doesn't take away that primacy or originatory nature that I'm speaking of. I think it's a very important fact. And I, of course, use it as a bridge to Venice and back from Venice to Tyre, because of the departure from the old static landmass of man, which was the ice, cave, Pleistocene man, and early agricultural man, until he got moving, until he got towns, so that the last polis or city is Gloucester. That's not just a millennial focus, but remembering Dante, metaphorical, analogical, and anagogical as well. A fourfold vision is given to me. Brooks Adams then offered Olson another way out of the static categories of history and politics that prevented the kinds of perception so essential to his theories. The one qualification Olson offered about Adams's work was his greed, an analogical reasoning for nature as machine in the Bibliography on America, which Dorn said many years later in a private conversation should probably be disregarded. From that bibliography to the Vinland Map Review 10 years later, to one of his last essays, continuing attempt to pull the taffy off the roof of the mouth in 1969, Brooks Adams was one of the touchstones for Olson's thought. So I thought it might be useful to find out why. Thanks.
So a few acknowledgements. Thanks so much to Josh for organizing the panel and doing everything that you've done. Thanks so much to Jeffrey Gardner for sharing some archival documents with me that show up in my talk today. That was probably 3 or 4 years ago at an ALA conference, I think in San Francisco. Maybe it was longer. I don't know. And also Melissa Waterworth for her steadfast stewardship of the Olson archive. And then finally, thanks to everyone for letting me come along and learn with you all today. I have no slides, but I do have something that might help orient the opening. So I'm going to share my screen for just a second. Okay, so this is it's called the Think Outside the Box puzzle. I don't know if you've ever seen it. It's 9 dots. The challenge is to join the 9 dots with 4 straight lines without lifting the pen. This is the origin for the expression think outside the box. And what you do is you essentially have to trace the line outside the box. The perception is that you have to stay inside the 4 lines. Okay, so with that there, set the clock. Thinking outside the box was not yet part of the American vernacular in 1951 when Charles Olson wrote to Robert Creeley using the phrase Western box. While thinking outside the box wouldn't gain popularity until the 1970s, the 9-point game to which the phrase referred was already in circulation and carries some relevance to Olson's coinage. Both point to limits in a given epistemological system. The titular clue in Think Outside the Box did little to assist players because it called upon a different episteme, a descriptive base of learning, which carried little relevance for a task that required performative knowledge. To figure out the puzzle, then, one not only had to trace lines outside the box, but also think outside the box of the title, or learn from some other mean than the one proposed. Along these lines, the Western box is not simply a set of text or cultural practices. Getting outside the box was not a matter of replacing the Western canon, Gemistos 1429 and up, with Olson's chosen example of non-Western logography, the glyph alphabet of the Mayans. This would succeed in establishing another closed system, a Mesoamerican box. To reprise the often cited claim, Olson argued that the Western conception of understanding, logos, had since Plato become the dominant function of language, following the Greek miracle when myth and reason were sundered. The result was an impoverished conception of the real, which served to reinforce an idea of knowledge as a set of abstract categories, evading that value Olson held most high, radical particularity. And yet, Olson, as the poet pedagogue, develops a poetics in which, to quote Lisa Jarnow, logos in the form of a nuanced pursuit of learning is as exciting as eros. Much scholarship has addressed this tension, trying to offer some framework for identifying what thinking or learning outside the Western box looks like. Miriam Nichols, for instance, sees in what she calls Olson's transcendental empiricism, a departure from an epistemology of knowing that to a Tao or way of knowing how, evidenced in his obsession with methodologies. Similarly, Peter Middleton has recently shown the extent to which Olson's poetics bear out an ambition to read the field poem in relation to post-war developments in the academic field of physics. I want to continue this conversation by reading Olson's ideas about epistemological stakes of open field poetics, like Middleton, in connection with trends in post-war American academic and intellectual culture. Thinking outside the box may not have been vernacular in the 1950s, but the term vernacular itself was becoming a widespread feature of academic discourse in the university system during this era, Today, we take it for granted that vernacular can refer to practices and objects that are not strictly linguistic in nature. During the years after the Second World War, this practice became formalized in a number of disciplines: architecture, American studies, history, and cultural anthropology. The folklorist and vernacular architecture historian Henry Glassy lays out the circumstance. Here's a quote: "When we isolate from the world a neglected architectural variety and name it vernacular," so a neglected variety, we call it vernacular, "we have prepared it for analysis. The term marks the transition from unknown to known. The study of vernacular architecture is a way that we expand the record bit by bit." The metaphor of the box is a helpful heuristic to explain the work performed by vernacular upon becoming an analytical category, as suggested by Glassy. The box here is the academic record. In the interest of making the record coterminous with the very bounds of human making, the scholar uses the term vernacular as a means of preparing a special class of unknown objects for investigation. Preparation in this case entails creating an enclosure on a basis of exceptional exemplarity in order to abstract the individual object to the level of class categorization. Preparation makes possible comparison. To go from unknown to known, as Glassy puts it, is to render the unknowable legible, which assumes that the highest value lies in transparency and understanding, and that empirical research methods provide the best chance for creating representative modes of understanding. Glassy's description is, to a degree, paradigmatic for the kind of epistemological function associated with the label vernacular during Olson's life. And yet, there were instances in which academics recognized the compromise being struck by submitting the unknown to the calculus of knowing. One of those academics turned out to be a Wesleyan classmate of Olson's, who also worked with the poet and Melville enthusiast Wilbur Snow, and ultimately was responsible as associate editor of Harper's for publishing sections from Olson's Enniscorthy Suite. That was one of Olson's first major publications. John Hoeynck is this classmate. And in 1948, he published Made in America, some 300 or so pages, a text which represented the most extended theorization of vernacular in the emergent field of American studies, where it was already serving as one of the founding premises for the institutionalization of that field. Hoeynck argued that attempts to study the arts and culture of the US had failed to grasp the, quote, authentic, in quote, basis of American life because they concerned themselves with the wrong materials. 19th century Americans did not show themselves as distinct people in their literary or fine arts. Rather, as he argued, the driving force that best captured the patterns of national life were technological advancements. This entailed advancements in the steam engine, railroads, military armaments, domestic wares, as well as urban and rural prefabricated architecture. From here, he defined the vernacular as, quote, that crude but vigorous form in which the untutored creative instinct sought to pattern the new environment, end quote. But changing the object of appraisal was not only part of the problem. Later in the 1960s, Hoeynck, when asked to serve in a published forum addressing the perennial question first posed by another classmate of Olson's, Henry Nash Smith, can American studies develop a method? He returned to his argument about the materiality of the New World, the way in which vernacular culture had generated these totems of democratic industrialization, insisting that there is the need for a method that can address these objects in their unique forms, rather than simply treating them as instances to fit in one of several categories. Following his reading of 19th century American lexicographer Alexander Bryan Johnson, Hoeynck saw this as an unavoidable problem because there were two different ontologies at play. This is a quote. The radical imitation of words, their radical defect, is that they are general terms or names referring to things that are individual and particular, end quote. Hoeynck enlists the Whitmanian example of grass to prove his point. While no two blades, quote, are alike, the word grass suggests an identity, which encourages the perceiver of language to discard the different looks, feels, tastes, and smells of the uncounted blades that comprise the actuality of grass as we experience it, end quote. Hoeynck's complaint bears a strong resemblance to Olson's long-standing obsession with haptic tangibility. The two men were working in similar territory early in their careers, as evidenced by Hoeynck citing Call Me Ishmael in his brief discussion of Melville from Made in America. There he foregrounds Olson's point that the whale ship in its hulking materiality was nothing less than a factory, and thus an instance of what Hoeynck saw as American vernacular ingenuity. But the two never discussed the trap that Hoeynck found himself in later in his career, finding a way to engage with the vernacular without devaluing its singularity. A letter to his old classmate may have proved generative, though, as Olson was not only engaging in the same line of thought, but was invoking the term vernacular to do so. Beginning in 1954, Olson, in several unpublished documents, begins to use the term vernacular as a critical supplement to arguments that he was making in regards to speech in his circulated published texts. Where discourse was the lingua franca of the box, Speech for Olson pointed to direct action, public communication, and the physical materiality of the speaker, all he felt had been imperiled by not only the, quote, universe of discourse, but also the technological advancements, including print. And this is a quote from Carla Billeteri. We are used to thinking of logos as the sense of discrimination, but speech as a general term for discussing the body and embodied knowledge is less familiar and has led to a mischaracterization of Olson's speech-based poetics as purely performance-oriented. Though there is no evidence that Olson turned to vernacular out of fear of potential misprision, the term does offer exactly what Billeteri points out, a way of clarifying his arguments. There are three texts that are central for understanding the poet's ideas about vernacularity. Letter to Elaine Feinstein in the late 60s, 68 or 69, no, late 50s, 58 or 59. His unpublished Shakespeare book, around 54, 55, I believe, and the posthumously published Principle of Measure and Composition by Field, Projective Verse 2. And Josh, you would know best, is that 56, 57 that he's composing that? I couldn't get a date.
I believe it's 58, 59.
Okay, thanks. So it's the Shakespeare book, then Projective Verse 2, and then Feinstein letter. While none of these texts are directly engaged with coherently laying out a theory of vernacular, taken together, they engage directly with the dilemma articulated by Hoeynck. And Olson's writing, the term vernacular exceeds any discrete consideration of language style or lexical set and touches directly on the tool question, the question, what do we pay attention to? And more importantly, what are the responsibilities of ethical attention? The answer to the first question is simple, as Olson proclaims in Projective Verse 2 on the topic of vernacular poetry or vernacular poetics. There is no content to which a poem is alien, none. The answer to the second, what are the responsibilities of ethical attention? His response essentially his imagined response to what Hoeynck would pose. To get to that answer, we have to consider the source of Olson's thinking about vernacular. Insurrection bears its insight in the field of institutionalization, and the critique of Western epistemology is rooted in one of the most central canonical figures of Western canon, one of the most central figures in the Western canon. Likely following encouragements of Pound, Olson's primary source for all things vernacular is Dante, specifically his 1304 treatise De Vulgare Eloquentia. He worked from an abridged copy collected in the Smith and Park's The Great Critics, 1939 anthology, which presents the first published English translation by A.G. Ferrers Howell from 1890. There's lots that we can say about Olson's relationship to Dante, and I take that up at length. But from Dante, Olson gains an understanding of vernacular as more than an object of study or material for appropriation, but at once a class of objects and the process by which these objects and acts are created. Olson arrives at this point by considering Dante's definition of the vernacular. You know it, pardon my, the redundancy. I call vernacular language that which infants acquire from those around them when they first begin to distinguish sounds. Or to put it more succinctly, I declare that vernacular language is that, and this is the important part, which we learn without any formal instruction by imitating our nurses. While Dante sets up the vernacular in contradistinction to grammar, another term that carries implicit associations with language, the aspect that distinguishes both categories is not intrinsic to language. Vernacular is not in this formulation a quality or characteristic of spoken or written language. It distinguishes on the basis of how one acquires language, making it at base a consideration of epistemology. Two epistemes, one informal, the other formal. For Dante alone is right, Olson proclaims, when he says that vernacular is not just your infant speech, but also that first speech employed by the human race. He indicating for all time the only possible position one can take toward form. He adds, what we learn in the first instance when we first quote, and this is Olson quoting, speak, is what will always pull us down, is what each of us has, and therefore will always be what we speak from. What these lines point to is that for Olson, Dante theorizes vernacular as a mode of discernment that precedes not only the abstraction of logos, but also the assumption of an individual subjectivity. The shift from a language to a broader interest in epistemology is made explicit in the second passage by Olson's emphasis on what we learn. Even when, the phrase what we learn, even when Olson aligns vernacular with speech in the passage, he brackets the verb speak with quotation marks, as if to say that speak here covers a host of activities when we first speak, or when we first do X or Y. What matters for Olson is that here stands a theory of communication that reinforces his own sense of the connection between speech and the significance of prime forms, of first efforts, of learning by intuition. The vernacular is not strictly what one speaks, but what one speaks from, a body of nuanced knowledge acquired intuitively from immediate sources. Read against Cohen-Hoven's question, how does one engage with the radical particularity of American vernacular culture with a form meant to abstract and thus mitigate the distinctiveness of the object of inquiry? Olson's response, taking it from one R. Creeley, constitutes a reminder to consider that the form of inquiry is an extension, should be an extension of the object of inquiry. To do so is to recalibrate expectations about what it means to handle vernacular materials. Rather than transitioning them from unknown to known, the record of the study becomes its own vernacular act, an enactment of the object. Olson glosses this challenge in the Shakespeare book when he writes, "And to verse now, at least in America, where the question of how to get a, quote, thinking in without any diminishment of vernacular power is very much a headache," end quote. The power that Olson attributes to the vernacular is its obduracy, its resistance to abstract categorical thought, as he states in projective verse 2. This would be the vernacular, from and by which the poem keeps its density, as well as out of which it draws its own clarity. This is not the clarity of knowing, but the lucid precisions of obstruction, preserved through minimal interference, a process Olson calls least action, or in the case of the poem, least song, which I go into further in other version of this. So vernacular offers Olson a way of clarifying and reinforcing his claims about the relationship of material to thought, while also placing his experiments in the historical context of its day. It reminds us that, like scholars in various fields, poets of the post-war avant-garde were enlisting the term vernacular to achieve similar ends, to expand a field. The challenge that they faced plays out in the tensions inherent in the term vernacular, which, as much as it points to the outside, often replicates the epistemological assumptions of the inside. The drive, last sentence, the drive to stand outside the box, to, in Louise Bogan's terms, look for some poetic form that can accommodate anything and everything, including ordinarily rejected and suspect materials, stands like vernacular, defined in relational counterpoint to the grammar of closed epistemes. Thanks so much.
All right. Thank you very much, Pete. Great job. All right. Our third presenter then will be Jeff Davis. Jeff, are you there? There we go.
Yep. All right. I'm going to be talking about Tawil. which Olson became very interested in. The last decade of Olson's life brought a new poetics and a recognition of new intellectual and spiritual guides, among them Henri Corbin. Corbin was a French philosopher and scholar who spent decades inquiring into ancient Iranian religious traditions and Islamic mysticism, and became a longtime member of the Uranus Circle, which formed around the work of Jung. His work began appearing in English in 1957, crucially for Olson, in Man and Time, which was a volume in the papers from the Uranus Yearbook series, published by the Bollingen Foundation. In that volume, Olson encountered Corbin's cyclical time and his Maoism and Mazdaism. It had tremendous impact on his thought. Avancina and the Visionary Recital, which appeared in 1960, offered narratives and explications, which became central to Olson's readings and talks for the rest of his life. As with his encounter during this same decade with the work of Eric Havelock, Olson found in the work of Corbin both confirmation of his own earlier intuitions and explorations and guidance along roads leading to further integrations, some of which left his exegetes and followers in the dust. Maximus 456 greatly expanded the range of the discourse of the Maximus poems. In its second poem, Maximus from Dogtown 1, introduced mythic motifs into the poem with a grand flourish. Gloucester being a seaport and fishing village, deep swirling oceanos first emerged here into the poem and went on to become a recurring figure. A few poems later, Algonquin myth likewise gets folded into the poem's dialogical structure. Olson's intense study of the work of Henri Corbin had confirmed his sense that myth and history were inextricably fused in the work of the imagination, and his interest in Corbin's work manifested in many ways in the poems of this new volume. The poems published as Maximus 3 extended into further depths Olson's epic performance. Mike Bone writes of this turn in Olson's life as the end of the new American poetry. It did lead to schisms, certainly, and unhappy transformations of long-time associations. Per Bone, there were roughly two phases to Charles Olson's life in poetry. The first ran from his departure from government in 1944 and 1945 until his arrival in Buffalo in 1963 and the Berkeley Poetry Conference in 1965. It's the time of his correspondence with Robert Greeley, his time at Black Mountain College, and the ascendancy of the new American poetry. The other period extends from 1963 to his death in 1970. Those years were defined in part by his break with the literary world and all its trappings and goings on, and his commitment to a poetry of spiritual ordeal. He announced that that development at a Berkeley conference, at the famous Berkeley conference, by staging an event that displaced traditional and expected poetry reading behavior, you might say, calling into question the transformation of some of the leading poets of the new American poetry into, quote, literary figures. Al Glover has referred to it as a tawil, citing Henri Corbin's book on Avancina. The resulting event alienated many of his old friends, including Robert Greeley, Ed Dorn, and Tom Clark, who characterized Olson's presence in Buffalo as a hypostatization and never tired of denigrating Olson's students and friends in Buffalo, end quote. Olson had given up the fundamentally secular approach to mind and its constructs of reality, quote, that shaped his writing and his thought through the first 50 years of his life, and it opened his eyes of necessity to other possibilities of vision. He had become, in Tom Clark's account, a religious poet, and Tom Clark did not mean that as a compliment. Jack Clark tried to persuade him that the matter was not so simple. John Jack Clark was a Blake scholar who met Olson in 1964 at a party thrown by the chairman of the English department, Al Cook, when he came to Buffalo to interview for a faculty position, which he got. He was actually considering not taking it until he met Olson. So he and Olson clicked immediately, and Clark became a fast friend and a proponent of Olson's writing, and a groundbreaking poet in his own right, until his death some 22 years after Olson's. Olson said, "Jack Clark gave me Blake." Under his guidance, Olson deepened his knowledge of Blake's work, even declared Blake a greater poet than I'll ever be in one of his letters. And perhaps a smidgen of Blake's attitude towards the world of writing and publication rubbed off on him. Excuse me. Blake, of course, published only one small volume through the usual channels of the day during his lifetime, and engraved and printed his own work for friends and patrons the rest of his life. Some of his major works survive in fewer than a dozen copies. Blake, too, was a religious poet. Clark gives an account of a June 28, 1991 letter, in a June 28, 1991 letter to Tom Clark after the publication of his biography of Olson, Charles Olson, Allegory of the Poet's Life, which had disparaged Olson and essentially portrayed him as a derelict, Creeley's word, per boer, during his last years. According to Clark, this is Jack Clark, the whole issue is over the spiritual. The curriculum, as you know, is of the soul. When we were starting out with the curriculum of the soul, Robert Kelly put the project down for dredging up the old question of the soul again, and Charles canceled him. Never darken my door again. Creeley and I have always parted company on this issue, but it wasn't openly stated because there was no occasion till now. Now, finally, this groundswell of resentment and possessiveness has become the occasion of the public exposure of different frames, Bob's word, of Olson by people who knew him at different, quote, times in his life. And any special view of Olson might be called possessive of him. But I think what has spooked Bob, his word, is what he regards as religious contexting of Olson. Our problem all along, and maybe Kelly was right in a way, was to leave or propose things in a, for lack of a better term, spiritual vocabulary of enthusiasm in a time of the end of existential humanism. This, of course, began for me and most others of the curriculum of the soul crowd long before any association with Olson. What is problematic for Bob, I think, is including his Olson in such dread, his word, when he has been at pains for some time to, quote, edit out the kook strain and make Charles available to all. Problem is, it hasn't worked out that way by expunging the real agenda of his work in the church forever. In fact, any theoretical side to it. And you know how such dogmatic statements as that which exists through itself, etc., can be heard as essentially of an existential context, as in Creeley's things come and go, so let them poem, which is terrific, but at another orientation than the Golden Flowers say, among many possible, as extraneous to what the poem itself is saying. Sometimes true, but not as agenda. One is, as in the Mobius strip, one side turns into the other easily and back. And if you don't have or propose the two, what have you got? Certainly not Olson, who was a stickler on this point. Biomorphism, the fusion of the two sides into one. He taught, as you know, always the two, whether genetics or morphology or etc., but never what Blake accused William Wordsworth of, the atheism of the world of nature. Charles suckered everybody into the idea he cared about what the world thought, but by his life, the choices he made, willy-nilly even, you know, he didn't really. He was driven surely to and by another outcome. Tom Clark, perhaps needlessly to say, was not persuaded. And so we have the primary biography of Olson that we have, such as it is. Clayton Esselman, a decade later, also weighed in on Olson having become a religious poet. And I won't go into this whole thing, but Olson is certainly entitled to his feelings, Esselman says. But as far as the poem goes, the repeated declarations of abject self-pity and the appeals to God represent an abandoning of the Maximus Olson presence, foregrounding instead the intrusive voice of pathetic Charles on his knees before God. And he references a poem on page 561 of the Maximus poems, which I really wish we had time to go into. But needless to say, it's not a Christian hymn or a Christian prayer. And the poem is actually a 5-pager. It starts on page 559 for those of you who are reading along at home. And so I think Esselman just misread it. Not to rehash in too much detail these old disputes, however much they still color the reading and teaching or not of Olson's work, especially in the Maximus poems. Olson made use of Corbin material in presentations multiple times. In the Causal Mythology lecture at Berkeley, the Poetry and Truth lectures at Beloit, Under the Mushroom, even before then in Vancouver in 1963. He talked about Corbin a lot. What was it that he found in Corbin? More than angels and bridges and Tawil, for sure. Here's Corbin. To integrate a world, to make it one's own, also implies that one has emerged from it in order to make it enter into oneself. This is precisely the experience attested by Avancina's in his visionary recitals, and they thereby attest what is most contemporary to us in his teaching. At the frontier reached by the recital of Hey Ibn Arabi, the soul has the experience that by acquiring consciousness of itself, anima, it can know the angel. But knowledge of the angel and the pleroma of the angel are beyond the system of the cosmos and its spheres. They must be left behind. Only then can this world be interiorized and reconquered by the soul as truly its own. At this frontier, the philosopher describes his self. Beside this passage and notations preserved at the Maud Olson Library in Gloucester, Olson has written, exclamation point, holy unbelievableness, read Friday night for now 2 a.m. and wrote last notes in kitchen before going to bed, 2 p.m. Friday, March 4th, 1966. 12 hours of writing from this passage. And we're only on page 15. Corbin tells us the example of Avancina invites us to make that effort towards acquisition of consciousness from the point of view of the conscious personality. This understanding is called integrative or integration. But to integrate a world, to make it one's own, also implies that one has emerged from it in order to make it enter into oneself. So knowledge itself, world, self-integration, these have been among Olson's concerns and values for decades. From at least the mid-50s, for instance, Olson had cited John Keats' late letter, a man's life is a continual allegory, and very few eyes can see the mystery of his life. A life, like the scriptures, figurative. Shakespeare led a life of allegory. His works are the comments on it, which ironically Clarke uses as the epigraph for his book. Olson had been investigating this mystery, and now Corbin provided him with new tools not readily accessible in the toolbox of the Western intellectual tradition. Tawil was especially important. Tawil, per Corbin, is a procedure that engages the entire soul because it brings into play the soul's most secret sources of energy. And of course, that's underlined by Olson. Tawil is etymologically and inversely to cause to return, to lead back, to restore to one's origin, and to the place where one comes home. Consequently, to return to the true and original meaning of a text. It is to bring something to its origin. Thus, he who practices the Tawil is the one who turns his speech from the external towards the inner reality. This must never be forgotten. When in current usage, Tawil is said, and rightly, to be a spiritual exegesis that is inner, symbolic, esoteric, etc. Beneath the idea of exegesis appears that of a guide, the exegete, and beneath the idea exegesis, we glimpse that of exodus, of a departure from Egypt, which is an exodus from metaphor and the slavery of the letter, from exile and the accident of exotic, exoteric appearance to the orient of the original and hidden idea. Where does this exegesis or Tawil lead back? And to what does it lead back? The question implies another, whom does it lead back? And to whom does it lead back? These are precisely the two fundamental aspects that the contexture of our visionary recitals presents to investigation. The first aspect concerns the Tawil of text. The second aspect concerns Tawil as Tawil of the soul. There's synchronism and correspondence here accurately defines the hermeneutic circle in which a symbolic vision flowers, and through which every true interpretation of its symbols must pass. Under this, Olson has summarized the passage, December 1967, Tawil, to cause to return to one's origins, to the place where one comes home. To the place where one comes home is underlined. Here. Much of the next several pages have been underlined in Olson's copy. All the next 4 pages, in fact, are all heavily underlined and annotated. The section on angelology, a bit further into the book, likewise shows evidence of having been not just read, but studied intently. There's a good case to be made that in the last years, Olson was living in an imaginal world, a cosmos that Corbin had helped create. By the time he got to Storrs in the fall of 1969 for what proved to be his final semester of teaching, Olson had changed spiritually and psychologically enough that his former student from Buffalo, Charles Brover, who didn't share what Charles Boer described as Olson's, quote, view of pan-hippieism as the key to our national salvation, end quote, kidded him about having missed Woodstock. Quote, all your people were there, end quote. Boer also notes, addressing Olson as he would in a letter, you believed in the Arab concept of Tawil, that you walked leftwards to meet the angel of your own being who is walking backwards until you pass through and become yourself. You recommended to them the Meccan revelations of Ibn Arabi. By Tawil, you said, you retard eternity, you fall back into the world. You call this act of falling precarity, involving the loss of one's own identity. Again and again, you would tell them to fall back into the world and to fall back into the world, into the word. Pathology was not reference, not metaphor. It was an inner inherence that one had to learn in order to give control over time and space, the retardation of eternity. One day as Olson and Boer were walking in the countryside near Storrs, Boer says, Olson kept telling me that this was paradise, that I was an angel sent to guide you through it. I laughed at first and felt flattered, but you kept repeating this. You would turn to me and demand to know if I was not in fact an angel sent to guide you through paradise. You insisted that I tell you the truth. I knew that you'd been studying the Angelology of Ibn Arabi, the 13th century Arab theologian and mystic, but I hardly expected you to apply it so locally. Olson doesn't, so far as I've been able to determine, to this point, say that he came to regard his own work as a tawil, a hermeneutics of the world. He doesn't seem to have ever referred to it as such. His embrace of Corbin, though, led others to make the connection between tawil and the inquiry of the poem, notably George Kasha and Robert Kelly. And you can find resources online for their views on Olson and tawil. I won't repeat them here. The situation is somewhat like the one we find with parataxis and the language poets. Olson used paratactic structures to sometimes great effect and always to significant effect. The language poets simply adopted parataxis as a writing strategy without attention to meaning, as a way to destabilize the referential field of language within which a piece of writing might take place. So with tawil, Olson introduced it to the polis, but to the generation of poets after Olson, they reinterpreted their explicit poetics in the language it's brought by Corbin's work into the discourse. Robert Kelly's work, notwithstanding his early concerns about Olson having reintroduced the soul, it evolves there into a processual poetics that has had real impact on other generations of writers. Olson had made history of in the social world of political action his focus up to his 60s turning point, and he would never, of course, lose interest in the historical and social, but now he had surrendered the prospect of raising a social movement, a literal polis, as his life goal. And he worked to create a visionary world instead. He writes poems that are more mythic, also writes more poems in a voice we can hear as personal rather than the voice of Maximus. That world offered Olson companionship of a different order. Not a polis, perhaps, but a community of sages that spoke from eons of human experience, of suffering, of revelation on the blue sphere of the earth. He looked back to the coherent world of the primordial imagination. Olson had been seeking, a place Olson had been seeking since he left his career in the political world and started out his journey as a writer. I believe Corbin helped him get there. And there he could wrestle with his deepest fears, his deepest losses, and write some of the finest poems of his life. Ever the archaeologist of morning, he had found a new dawn.
Okay, thank you very much, Jeff. I'm going to switch back to gallery view now, and so I think we have time for Q&A. So if people want to ask some questions or make comments for our presenters, now would be the time to do that. We also have the chat here, so if anybody wants to drop a question into the chat, that's fine too. I can go ahead and read off those. But yeah, we'll open it up for questions now.
I have a question. Can I ask a question, Josh?
Yeah, sure, Pete. Please.
It's for Jeffrey, or do you prefer Jeff?
Yeah, I do. Can you hear me?
Actually, the panelist, Jeff.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
It's okay.
Yeah, Jeff. Right.
Jeff Davis is never Jeffrey. He's Jeffrey.
Right. So I don't know much about Corbin. I know that there's a resurgence of poets that I'm in conversation with that are reading the work and interested in the work. But it recently dawned on me. I was looking at the Louis Menard Free World book, the recent intellectual biography, and he mentions that Corbin was the translator, the first French translator for Heidegger's Basis Métaphysique. And I wonder, there's been like Bouvet did a reading of Heidegger and Olson. There are Heideggerian readings of Olson. I'm wondering if there's some relationship between what you saw in Corbin and maybe like a Heideggerian position, or any kind of relationship there, given the translation project?
So I've actually been in correspondence with Tom Cheatham, who's the leading English language scholar of Corbin. And I know he's working right now on exploring the Heidegger connection. Yeah, I think it's there. The whole concept of what does Heidegger call it? Dwelling is something that finds a lot of echoes in Corbin's work. So, yeah.
Like we'll poetically man dwells, that famous,
right.
Yeah.
Right, yeah, right. Mm-hmm. Tom's courses, which he offers, every 6 months or so, by the way, are really worth taking if you're at all interested.
Who is this person, Tom?
Tom Cheatham, Cheetham. He has a website on Corbin, which also brings Olson into the discussion.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Yeah, that's where I first actually started working when I started exploring this connection. Well, we're checking out. Let's see if I can find it, the link. Let's see.
Could I had one other question, Josh. I'm a little chatty Cathy right here.
No, that's fine, please.
And this is a question for, I guess, everybody in the room. There was like a second version of my talk that I started and dashed because it seemed, well, I don't think I could have finished it in time. And it was essentially thinking about the Western box as a reception mode and how scholarship around Olson continues to perpetuate this. And for a poet, which is really interesting, I think, about Davis's presentation, is that there's this, it seems to be a preponderance of readings of Olson that maintain this kind of continental European interlocutor format, where we read him in relationship to Deleuze, or we read him in relationship to, like I said, Heidegger, or even people he wasn't reading, right? Like Dewey or Hannah Arendt. But, one of the ways I read projective verse is kind of like a new world poetics. And there's so many people in the Caribbean that are doing similar work. And Nathaniel Mackey has started to gesture towards that, right? Like, but I just wondered if others thought about that. Like, I mean, how do we kind of perpetuate the Western box in our readings of Olson?
I could talk about that a little bit, Pete, just from my own kind of point of view and like my own history of like sort of the stuff that I've worked on and written about primarily, because a lot of what I've done in the past is work with Whitehead and Olson. And in some ways, Whitehead, he's an analytical philosopher. He's a mathematician. I mean, he's at Cambridge, obviously, before he goes to Harvard and is in the philosophy department there. And of course, Olson read Whitehead and really enjoyed, and really built a lot of that into his poetics. So one of the things I kind of like about the idea of what you're doing with that projective verse 2 thing that I published is that it looks at that line about the vernacular, which is a non-Whiteheadian thing, right? Like that term is like a bunch of, that essay that I published, like tons of it is him just like copying out of certain chapters in Whitehead almost. But that term kind of always stuck out to me. And so I do wonder if, I think it's really important to think about how Olson was transforming his texts, how he was building on them, the way that the creative process itself you know, sort of pushes beyond just a kind of like one-to-one reading. Like when we do this source work, I don't think it should just be like kind of a philological thing. We have to really pay attention to like that creative moment of transformation. And so that's one of the challenges, I think, of reading this kind of material. And with Whitehead too, you know, he does look like a Western philosopher in a lot of ways, like a, you know, analytical Western philosopher, but there's also strange stuff in him about, which I haven't, you know, looked into enough, I think. But at the beginning, he even says at one point, readers may find that like my theses bear more similarity to what does he say, like Buddhist and Eastern modes of thinking, you know, and then that's like the only thing he says about it, like in kind of like Whiteheadian fashion. But I mean, I think that there would be a way of, you know, of kind of like redoing that in some sense. It's not something I've done yet, you know, so I do think about that too.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's one answer.
That's great. Thank you.
So Ben Friedlander has a comment in the chat actually about if you're looking at the chat, we certainly need an indigenous reading of Maximus as an epic of settler colonialism. And those of you who are watching Ben's Facebook page occasionally too know that there was some discussion of this on Facebook a couple of weeks ago, with a lot of poets kind of got involved and had some thoughts about it. I wonder if anybody has thoughts about that, because I do think that there's something there about settlement as well in the Maximus poems, and Olson's real kind of obsession with Native Americans, you know, that they appear, you know, consistently throughout, you know, the Algonquin thing with the man with the house on the head and stuff like that. That's all there. And so I wonder if people had thoughts about that, because that's something that was also in the air recently. Or not, I don't know. Zoom.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like the start of that begins with the Yepes book, right? Like it seems like that's the opening salvo of that reading is thinking about the Empire book, which would pair with Joe's talk on Empire.
There are people who like that book. I don't know any of them myself. Jeff, I thought it was interesting when you talked about Creeley separating himself from Olson. I know that a friend of some of us here, Kent Johnson, sees that as a crucial breaking point of American poetry. And I don't know, what do you think about that? You think that that was a diverging of the twain there?
There was. I mean, you know, they have very different temperaments, I think, Creeley and Olson, and in some ways. Curiously, that poem that Eshelman trashes in his talk, the one he references page 561, that's actually one that Creeley includes in Olson's selected poems in 1997. So after this brouhaha, as it were, around Clark's biography and so on, I think Creeley took another look, perhaps, at some of the later work. Granted, and it's a pretty religious poem. I mean, it's quote, quote, religious, you know, it's a prayer, it's a hymn in some ways. And nevertheless, it makes it into Creeley's edition of Olson's selected poems. Interesting. I mean, it's, you know, yeah, they were human beings.
Jeff,
Yeah.
do you think there's any connection between that rift between Olson and Creeley, and then Creeley moving on towards engaging with or appreciating whatever it might be called, the language poets.
Yeah, I do think that's part of, yeah. That's about the same time that Creeley was, of Creeley's interest in the language poets, which went on for, a decade or so. It's hard to imagine.
Yeah, it always took me by surprise that, he made that.
Yeah, likewise, even though in some ways pieces is like, the language poets took pieces as, I think, a primary text or as an initial text in some ways, legitimated some of their own work. Creeley has every line is an analysis of language, certainly in a lot of Creeley's work in that middle period. And, very, very good stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I'm fond of that book very much.
Oh, yeah, it's a great book. Indeed. Yeah. Do you write, sir? Yourself?
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. Good.
Yeah, but I gave up on poetry once the language poets came in, and so
they sort of changed everything, didn't they?
Kidding, no kidding.
Yep. And now they're doing autobiographies. Things will change again.
That was tough. And then Flarf came along.
Flarf, oh yeah.
Yeah, give me a break. How do we speak to each other anymore?
An important question. Yeah.
So I actually had a question for Joe, actually, about a term that you used, and I just wanted to ask if you wanted to say a little bit more about it, just by way of definition or your sense of it. But you mentioned at the start of your talk that you sort of saw Olson as a poet of negative entropy, I believe was the term you used. And I just wondered, like, if you could say a few more words about that, about how you see that and how you define that, because I think that it's kind of a compelling term, but I would want to make sure that I understood your usage of it before I went about repeating it or something like that.
It's not a word that you use in everyday conversation. I had to look it up myself. What is the opposite of entropy? I asked Google.
Might be Olson. Yeah. He never winds down.
Right. But reading a lot of Henry Adams's very late essays, and he took Brooks along for the ride. It was all about the second law of thermodynamics and how everything was heating toward eventual heat death and entropy, and everything was going to fall apart. And they bought it, the Adams brothers I'm talking about. And they said, well, yeah, what use is history? What use is culture in the face of this inevitable loss of order in the universe? And, you couldn't talk about that kind of stuff to Olson. Olson was all about, shaping the narrative into another order, into a new order, into, and get with it, citizens, Olson would say. And, so that's a complete difference, I think, between he and Adams. As I hope I said, there was a lot of things that they had in common as well, but not that, So that's that's the term. Neg entropy is reestablishing order.
Thanks, though. That's actually, it's useful. I just like when reading Whitehead with Olson at times, where the kind of like process is this sort of overarching thing that's kind of happening, and everything's sort of building, right, on top of one thing after another, and even terms that he uses in that Projectiverse 2, where he talks about how like a good poem should get attention to the variety of order and creation. I mean, even just like a proposition like that is so full of the idea that there's so much out there and there's so many different orders that you can kind of pile on top of each other and create these sort of transformations. So it's actually a very interesting term. I like it a lot. Thanks. Okay. Any other questions or yeah?
In terms of this, that I always go back to is one of Pound's lines. I think it's with his translation of the Trojan Women or something like that. And Pound notes, what splendor, it all coheres. And that would seem to me to be an amplification for what Joe was just saying about negentropy.
Yeah, but then how does that work in relationship to narratives of the split between modernity and postmodernity? You know, Olson's often played as a protagonist in that shift. I mean, order seems to be one of the things that isn't on friendly playing terms with postmodernity, as it gets theorized, you know, through either grand narratives by Lyotard or by Harvey. I mean, I'm wondering, like, is this like a place where there's inconsistency and there's like a proto-modernist streak that's persisting through Olson, or that there is essentially that Olson as a character doesn't cohere as a reader because we can see all of these kind of antagonistic strains that are played out without return to resolution?
I am not an expert on these matters in continental philosophy and certainly in postmodernism, but I think we are straying perilously close to the universe of discourse. I don't think that there is that much of a separation between order and chaos, at least in the way Olson saw process, you know, saw the local as not just the local, but as everything that came before it. And so I think that with that constant emphasis on movement and change, it kind of defeats the dichotomy of you know, what you were trying to say.
Okay, so we're at about 4:37, 4:40 now, so we've been going for quite a while. Are there any other questions or final thoughts, or do we want to call timeout now and get ready for tomorrow? Does that sound okay?
I have a final thought, which is that I had a really good time, and thank y'all. I learned a lot. That was great. I look forward to tomorrow.
All right. Yes. And okay. So for everybody who, if you don't know, we'll be reconvening tomorrow at 3 o'clock. We have 3 more presenters: Jeffrey Gardner, Seth will be talking after Jeff, and then Luke Franklin will finish it up for us. Okay. So I hope to see everyone again tomorrow at 3. Thank you all for coming very much.
Nice to see you all. Thanks.